Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more. And today we're going to be talking about the Season 2 of Mandalorian. Before we do, there's a couple of things I should get out of the way. One of which is that no matter how much I enjoy or don't enjoy Star Wars, it always is palatable to me. I've often compared it to pizza. I can enjoy the finest gourmet pizza, and I can also enjoy Chuck E. Cheese. It only tastes but so bad, except Litos. I don't mess with Litos. The second thing I should say is that my Star Wars 5 is usually a regular thing's 8 or 9 because of how much I just enjoy the stuff overall. And I should probably get that out of the way before we get into my kind of scoring and thoughts regarding The Mandalorian Season 2. So I'm not going to spend too much time on Chapter 9, The Marshal, because I went over the episode in full for a previous episode of Force Friday, but I do give this episode a 6 out of 10, mainly for not really contributing to an overall arcing story, although it does tie into the Boba Fett stuff. So I get its connections, but it still has that freak of the week nature that I'd like to see them move beyond. The same kind of goes for The Passenger, which I think is the worst episode of the season. I think it's kind of boring and doesn't really do a whole lot to grow the series or to grow the character, which is what I think the series is ultimately in desperate need of. It is directed by Peyton Reed, who did Ant-Man 1 and 2 for Marvel. Centers around the giant ant alien, seemingly references to Reed's work. Frog Lady is a new species not seen in the Cantina in A New Hope, although she is very much in the vein of the animal-type aliens we see in there. We also get to see the spiders in live action, which are pulled from Star Wars Rebels and were first featured in McQuarrie's art for Dagobah. And Dave Filoni's character Trapper Wolf has the Clone Wars Wolfpack Battalion logo on his helmet. But this very much has a freak of the week nature to it. It almost reminds me of like the first couple seasons of Smallville, where it's just like 30 to 40 minutes of a given story that really doesn't push the narrative nor character nor any growth about the series whatsoever. It's just characters doing things on screen. And I give this one a 6 as well. Moving into Chapter 11, The Heiress, written by Jon Favreau and directed by Bryce Dallas Howard, who spent an entire year planning every aspect of this episode's shoot. This is my favorite episode of the series. I give this one a 9 out of 10, with Bo-Katan making her debut, played by her voice actress Katie Sackhoff, accompanied by 2 Night Owl Mandalorians as seen in Clone Wars and Rebels. Another little fun fact is Star Wars mega fan and Sideshow site regular Titus Welliver plays the freighter captain. I love this episode because of what it starts to do in regard to defining the culture of the Mandalorians. We learn a little bit about the difference between how Bo-Katan sees the Mandalorians and how the Mandalorian sees the Mandalorians. And please don't take a shot for every time I have to say Mandalorian in this video. But it's been a big point of contention, right? As we've been looking at this series and talking about previous characters from this culture and asking, well, why don't they seem to follow the same rules as him? And this starts to flesh that out a bit. Plus, it introduces Bo-Katan into live action, which is done perfectly. It's a water world. We get to see new stuff like a boat, which I know sounds silly, but it's just like, I like seeing new things in Star Wars and seeing how they work. Chapter 12, The Siege, written by Jon Favreau, directed by Carl Weathers. This episode pretty much centers around the Mandalorian having to destroy an Imperial outpost. We get to see some midichlorian injected test subjects floating in tanks, which is probably a link to the sequel trilogy. And although that plot thread is already at its end in the sequel trilogy, a lot about Star Wars tends to be connecting the dots from one point to another. And because there's a huge gap between 6 and 7 with still a lot of unanswered questions, I would imagine that this is some attempt to start fleshing that out a bit. I think this is cool and does have potential. Unfortunately, it doesn't move much beyond this in this series. So while I think that this has a lot of DNA in it to potentially grow something really interesting, as of right now, while enjoyable, I give this episode a 7 out of 10, which brings us to Chapter 13, The Jedi. This is written and directed by Dave Filoni, and it is the debut of Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka Tano, with Kyle Reese and Bruce Lee's goddaughter as the villains. Grand Admiral Thrawn's name is dropped and shown to be indirectly behind the events of this episode. Future seasons of Mandalorian, Ahsoka, Rangers of the New Republic, and possibly Book of Boba Fett will intersect and interweave. The common belief is that Thrawn is the grand villain behind this era and these shows, and even Esposito has recently hinted that Gideon is working for someone. So I also give this episode a 7 out of 10. While I enjoy seeing Ahsoka in live action, and I think that Rosario Dawson is probably the perfect choice, this particular story, once again, doesn't have a whole lot to do with the overarching narrative of The Mandalorian. It's just another freak of the week. It's another simple objective to accomplish within 30 to 40 minutes. And that doesn't inherently mean that it's it's not good television, but what it does mean is that it becomes less epic, right? Which is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for like an overall arcing thing to kind of sink my teeth into and like go along for the ride to see how it shakes out week to week. But what it ends up being for the most part is pretty much self-contained little stories with a couple of threads that loosely tie them all together. So while I enjoy a lot of aspects of this episode visually and even fan-wise, it doesn't do much objectively for the story. Then we have chapter 14, The Tragedy, directed by Robert Rodriguez of Sin City fame. Features the full debut of Boba Fett back in business, swinging gaffy sticks and doing kung fu. And he's partnered up with Fennec, who is the sniper from the first season. It features the major use of the Dark Troopers, who are an adaptation of the droids in the classic 90s video game Dark Forces. This episode does have a little drama attached to it, not in any juicy manner, but just that Rodriguez kind of came on at the last minute because I believe the director that was originally supposed to do this was already working on the Kenobi series at this point. Ended up being a scheduling conflict, I think, and Rodriguez pretty much stepped in to get involved. But I think he's now attached in major capacity to Star Wars, for better or worse. But the one thing about this episode is the ongoing debate about the Fetts is finally settled. Jango was a Mandalorian foundling who abandoned their ways after the Mandalorian Civil War. In this way, Boba is a Mandalorian descendant with a claim to his armor, but does not follow their ways or creed. Boba's chain code can be translated. It tells the armor's history and makes the broad strokes of the Legends comic Jango Fett Open Seasons canon. This episode I will also score at a 6 out of 10. And it comes down to like really fleshing things out. Like, we know that Yoda has to go to this place to sit on this rock and that somebody will come. But we don't know anything much beyond that. He sits on the rock and blue light comes out and then dark troopers take him away. And it's like, it feels like a means to an end to me without the whys being given to us. And the whys are what I need in order to kind of latch on to this series. So this is another one where I kind of feel like it's spinning wheels. Which brings us to chapter 15, The Believer, written and directed by Rick. I'm not even going to try it, but he did chapter 2 and 6 of the previous season. It features the return of Bill Burr, who people say is my doppelganger, as Miggs Mayfield. The Imperial Captain is played by Welsh actor Richard Blake, who played Joe Chill in Batman Begins, and the Night King in seasons 4 and 5 of Game of Thrones. And we also get the return of the seismic charge from Slave One. So I like this episode a lot. I give this one an 8 out of 10, and the reason why I do is because, for one, Bill Burr's character becomes more explained and defined than the Mandalorian himself in 30 minutes than our main character could seem to do in 2 seasons. But for 2 is that Bill Burr gives the perspective of like a regular guy in the universe to the Mandalorian, and he begins to challenge the Mandalorian's thoughts, beliefs, culture, and faith. And as a result, by the end of the episode, the Mandalorian has made decisions that are not in line with his kind of code or his zealotry. And I can't help but think that some of that is directly related to what Burr says about how we tend to adjust the rules to fit our way of life, right? When he says to the Mandalorian, you said you couldn't take your helmet off, but now you're wearing a stormtrooper helmet. So is the rule that you can't show your face, or is the rule that you can't take your helmet off? Because they are different. Like, it's a super solid point. And it comes down to culture, and it comes down to the way that we kind of explain why we do the things that we do that aren't necessarily in line with what we know we should or shouldn't do. And I think this has a huge impact on the character. It's one of those big growing moments for the character that we really haven't seen in this entire show, which is why it bumps it up to an 8. It would be more, but it's more about Bill Burr than it is about The Mandalorian. Which brings us to the last episode, The Rescue. Written by Jon Favreau, directed by Peyton Reed. There's a lot of talk around the Darksaber and the new codes and rules regarding it. In universe, you can explain it as Maul had abandoned the saber in his place as ruler in Rebels, meaning Bo was able to claim it, as Sabine was merely its guardian until a leader could be found. She also presumably lost it to Moff Gideon. She may have to win it back once it is lost. However, this does seem like another one of those situations where they're just making up rules as they go along in order to try to make the material more engaging. So it doesn't quite do it for me. This is the only episode to feature a post-credit scene. Bib Fortuna is played by Matthew Wood, who has been the primary sound engineer and designer on all Star Wars series and movies since 2005. He's also played numerous background aliens and characters, including the battle droids and General Grievous. The staff that Bib Fortuna is holding is the same one that was invented as an accessory for the original 1983 Kenner action figure. Which brings us to the main topic of this episode, right? Which is one that is spoilery. If you are not in for spoilers, I'm not sure why you're watching this, but if you don't want to be spoiled, back out now. I love that people love this show. I love that Star Wars is back in like the good graces of a particular swath of the fandom. I do. However, while I had an emotional reaction to seeing Luke again and the X-Wing and definitely R2, I'm disappointed in the same breath. And I'll tell you why. I don't think it makes much sense. And it feels like another way to shoehorn this character into a series that's operating just fine, apparently, to the mainstream audience anyway, without any direct connection to the original trilogy. I know that a lot of people are impressed to see Luke cutting droids in half, and that's what they've always wanted, and I'm glad that they get that. But for me, it's kind of like I'm not capable of seeing anything with Luke that's more badass than what we've already seen with Luke. I've seen the most badass thing I've ever seen. I've seen him turn face and take down an entire army without throwing a punch. So like anything that he does involving spinning a lightsaber around to a bunch of robots, it's never going to make me go, wow. Now, him popping up did make me go, wow. However, I do feel like, as a side note, the face mapping was not good. I don't know why Hot Toys can't seem to get his face right most of the time. Black Series can never get his face right, but neither can the ILM folks either, apparently. Just get the Winter Soldier to do it and let's be done with it. But this seemed like the ultimate kind of pandering. And as a result, to me personally, as a fan, it felt cheap. It felt like a cheap move. One that worked, because like I said, I had an emotional reaction to it, but cheap nonetheless. I'm sure I'll go into this in more detail on next week's Nerd Rage, but I'm not as blown away by that scene as a lot of people are. Now, with that out of the way, because that shouldn't be the main topic of this show, but you see how it is whenever the original trilogy becomes involved in something, it becomes the original trilogy show. And the original trilogy is never going to get any better than what it is. It's great because it's great, but there's a lot of other stuff that can get better, and I wish they would work on that. That being said, another thing that this does is it splits up the Mandalorian and the child. And while that may not stay the same forever, if it does, I think it's a huge loss. I think that this show has two major problems. For me, it's very successful, so what do I matter, right? But in regards to my opinion, is it doesn't form a crew. Every time it gets close to forming a crew, it breaks it up. But I'll tell you, Cara Dune, IG-11, Mandalorian, the child, you could even throw in the armorer and add Bill Burr to the mix, and you've got yourself a pretty cool squad that would have a lot of interesting back and forth character-wise if they let it happen. But they're not really interested in character on this show. And character is the backbone to what Star Wars is for me. So they continue to break up the crew, and while they continue to break up the crew, they refuse to give any sort of real depth to the character of the Mandalorian, and as a result, I'm left asking, why should I care? Now, I do care because it's Star Wars, and I'll always care, and I'm going to buy the toys, and I'm going to buy the merch, and I'm going to get my kids the socks, but it's not resonating with me on an emotional level. Splitting up Mando and the baby resonated with me on an emotional level, but once again, that comes back to them splitting up the crew. I might be getting emotional about that because I'm like, here we go again. I think that this show is ultimately just not for my type of fan, which is fine. But I think in a lot of ways, it doesn't have the soul that I'm looking for. It has a lot of the muscle, but not a lot of the heart. And I'd prefer a balance of both. But in order to feel satisfied, I need that heart and soul. So while I think it's good, fun, fast food, enjoyable, microwavable, and somewhat disposable content, it doesn't do much for satisfying me as a fan. But I'll still be here to watch next year. And just in case anybody was curious about my thoughts regarding a Boba Fett series, if they use it as a way to kind of get into the criminal underworld side of Star Wars, I'd be interested to explore that. But otherwise, I'm not really interested. I'll watch it and I'll probably enjoy it to the level that I enjoy this, but I'm not really interested. So when you take up all my scores for these episodes, and by the way, I give the Luke episode an 8 out of 10, and you average it out, it ends up being a 72%. And like I said, my C for Star Wars is probably an A for anything else, but a low C is probably exactly how I feel about this series. It's an acceptable grade to bring home, but you know your parents want to see you do better. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying sane. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.